Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. You are listening to, well, a stunning moment in history where a Gentile outsider completely out-argues a famous religious teacher at his own table.
Yeah, it's an incredible scene to picture.
Right. And today's deep dive into Mark chapter 7 is going to completely challenge what you think you know about this ancient narrative. But before we get there, I need to tell you the biggest revelation we are unpacking today. Because the opening debate we will discuss, it isn't actually about unwashed hands or, hygiene at all.
No, not even a little bit.
Right. It is about a financial loophole called Corban that the religious elite used to hoard wealth and essentially legally abandon their aging parents.
It's a massive shift in how you read the text.
Exactly. So we have an incredibly fascinating stack of primary text excerpts and historical briefings today. And our mission is clear. We want to explore the profound historical context, the intense political tension, and, the raw drama of a narrative that completely redraws the lines between insiders and outsiders.
Yeah, because it is a text that pulls absolutely no punches. I mean, we are looking at a profound, real-world collision of institutional power, money, and deeply entrenched social boundaries.
So let us set the scene. We open the chapter with an inciting incident. There is the arrival of the Pharisees and some scribes from Jerusalem, and they immediately target Jesus because his disciples are eating with unwashed hands.
Right, the famous unwashed hands.
But before we get into the history here, I have to ask a mystery question just to keep in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
Why would a powerful inspection team travel all the way from the headquarters of institutional religion in Jerusalem just to check if some Galilean disciples washed their hands before dinner?
It sounds kind of absurd to us today.
It does, but the answer has absolutely nothing to do with soap and everything to do with money, which we will unpack in just a second.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the Pharisees' concern about hand washing, it was not simple hygiene.
Right.
Like, if you are listening to this and picturing an ancient public health initiative about avoiding germs, you have to erase that picture completely.
Yeah, there was no germ theory back then anyway.
Exactly. It actually drew on purity codes that were originally developed exclusively for temple priests, and it extended those strict codes to ordinary daily life.
So they took rules meant for priests and applied them to everyone.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could theoretically view it as a democratizing impulse, bringing the sacred rituals of the temple into the average home. But in practice, it acted as a rigid social boundary marker.
It kept people out.
Right. It separated the strictly observant from everyone else. And it is crucial to note that these rules, they were not written in the Torah. They belonged to the oral tradition.
Wait, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. When you say oral tradition, we aren't talking about, like, a few polite customs. Right?
No, not at all.
We're talking about the tradition of the elders that was later codified in the Mishnah. But for the people living in this moment, the Mishnah didn't exist as a published book yet.
Precisely. It was a sprawling, unwritten web of legal precedents.
Wow.
Think of it as the ultimate set of societal unwritten rules, fiercely guarded by legal experts, that decided if you were in or out of acceptable society.
So if you didn't follow them,
you were culturally and religiously ostracized. It was that simple.
Man. So if you are listening to this and imagining a polite religious debate, you have to throw that idea out the window.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine a modern IRS audit mixed with a federal investigation happening right in your living room.
That's a great way to put it.
That is the tension when this inspection team shows up. And let's connect this to the money, because this is where Jesus fires back, and it gets incredibly intense.
It really does.
He quotes the prophet Isaiah, directly accusing this delegation of elevating man-made custom over divine command. And he brings up this specific term, Corban.
Right, Corban.
So looking at our historical briefing, Corban is an Aramaic term meaning, well, given to God. Let me try to make a modern analogy here.
Go for it.
It sounds essentially like setting up an untouchable offshore trust. Like you legally tie up your assets, claiming they're fully dedicated to the temple, specifically to find a workaround to Moses' command to support your parents on pain of death.
Yeah, that's exactly how it functioned.
You essentially tell your aging mother or father, sorry, the money I would have used to support you is Corban. It belongs to God now.
Yeah. And a formal vow of that kind, once made, was legally binding under the tradition of the elders.
That is wild.
It is. Jesus cites Exodus and Deuteronomy to show the absolute collision happening in front of them. Moses commands filial support on pain of death, but the oral tradition found a legalistic workaround to bypass it entirely.
Wow.
And if we look at the factions involved factually, the political tension is astronomically high. The scribes from Jerusalem are not local critics from the neighborhood.
Right. They aren't just local guys complaining.
No, Jerusalem controlled the temple, and the temple controlled the treasury, the sacrificial economy, and the legitimacy of every single local teacher in Galilee.
Hold on. So if I'm understanding the mechanics of this, Corban vows weren't just a private spiritual exercise.
Yeah.
If you pledge your assets to the temple, you are effectively increasing the temple's financial holdings, right?
Yes, that is the crucial mechanism here. The assets pledged to the temple increased its financial footprint and, by extension, its institutional power.
Really?
So when Jesus argues that such vows could be weaponized against the poor and the elderly, he is exposing a financial mechanism that directly benefited the temple establishment.
That is huge.
It really is. This is not a theoretical dispute over ancient texts. It is a public accusation that the keepers of the law are running a protection racket dressed in piety.
A protection racket. That's exactly what it sounds like. And the text gets so incredibly specific here. In Mark 7:9, Jesus says, "Full well do you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your tradition."
Right, that word reject.
Yeah, the word reject there is surgical. He's accusing them of being a little careless.
Yeah.
It's a deliberate substitution.
Yeah.
And then in Mark 7:13, he says they are making void the word of God by your tradition, which you have handed down. And he says, you do many things like this.
Many things like this.
That phrase, many things like this, it signals that Corban isn't some rare, isolated loophole. It's just one example in a much broader pattern of institutional behavior.
Which, logically forces a major turning point in the story. Think about cause and effect here.
Right.
Jesus has just publicly dismantled the institutional rules of what goes into a body to make it unclean. The entire framework of the Jerusalem scribes has been invalidated right in front of a crowd.
Yeah, once you completely invalidate the temple's food laws and publicly accuse the religious headquarters of financial corruption, you can't just stay in Galilee and pretend everything is normal.
No, absolutely not.
You've just made yourself a massive target. So what is the logical next step?
Yeah.
You get out of that jurisdiction entirely.
Precisely.
He turns to the crowd and upends the system, and then he physically moves.
Right. He tells the crowd that absolutely nothing entering a person from the outside makes them unclean. Instead, he argues that defilement flows outward from the heart.
Which is a huge paradigm shift.
It is. And then, privately, he unpacks this logic for his baffled disciples, effectively declaring all foods clean.
He must have been so confused.
Oh, totally. Because
Yeah.
he's saying the internal condition creates the defilement, not the external ritual at all.
And then comes the geographical shift. He journeys north to Tyre. Now, keeping strictly to our sources here, Tyre is Phoenician coastal territory.
Right.
We are talking about modern Lebanon. It is a Hellenized, non-Jewish region. And historically speaking, there is a long documented history of cultural friction and economic tension between the wealthy coastal city of Tyre and the rural agricultural region of Galilee.
Yeah, that context is so important to keep in mind.
It really is, because he is taking the narrative decisively outside Jewish ethnic territory.
It's a deliberate geographical shift that sets the stage for a massive interpersonal shift. Because he's physically moved beyond the borders of the purity laws he just debated?
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting. We reach the structural heart of this chapter. Jesus is in this non-Jewish Hellenized territory, and a Syrophoenician woman tracks him down.
Right.
She begs him to exorcise a demon from her daughter, and Jesus tests her with a metaphor. He tells her it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.
Which is a heavy metaphor.
It is. But she doesn't flinch. She answers him, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs."
It's such a brilliant response.
She out-argues him on his own metaphor, and she wins the healing, which is incredible. But, okay, I need to pause this here for a second.
Sure, what's up?
Because structurally, yes, it's an amazing debate. But if we are being honest, to modern ears, comparing this desperate mother to a dog sounds shockingly cruel.
Yeah, it really does.
So what does this all mean for the people witnessing it? Like, how did a room full of first-century listeners process that insult? How did this actually land in the room?
Well, it is a deeply unsettling scene. And Mark frames it with absolutely no apology and no editorial softening. But the text may suggest that this exchange would have landed very differently depending on who was listening.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, Gentile audiences listening to this account would have heard a woman from their own world step up and actually defeat a Jewish teacher at his own table.
Wow.
She is the only figure in the entire narrative of Mark who successfully does so.
That's incredible.
On the other hand, Jewish audiences would have watched their teacher grant a miracle to someone entirely outside the covenant. Either way you look at it, it fundamentally disrupts the expected social and religious order.
Man, think about what that means for the people witnessing it. He draws a boundary with his metaphor, testing the very limits of this new dynamic, and she simply refuses to accept it.
Right, she pushes right past it.
She leverages his own words to secure a miracle for her daughter.
Ugh.
She essentially demands that the grace he's offering extend beyond the borders he just crossed. She proves his earlier point, it's about the heart, not the external ethnic or religious boundaries.
And that momentum doesn't stop with her. Having granted a miracle in private to an outsider, the narrative loops into another Gentile territory where the healings become highly physical, public, and politically dangerous.
Yes, let's track that route because the geography tells a story of its own. He moves up through Sidon and then down into the Decapolis.
Right.
For those listening, the Decapolis was a league of 10 Greek-style cities east of the Jordan River. We were talking about heavily Gentile territory characterized by Greek architecture, pagan temples, and a distinct Hellenistic culture.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, this route is highly significant. We are talking about Roman-aligned Gentile territories.
Roman-aligned. That's a key detail.
It is. Factually speaking, you have an unpredictable Galilean healer with a growing crowd operating across ethnic and jurisdictional lines.
So let's put these political stakes in perspective, just to explain the mechanisms at play here. When we talk about the Herodian client-king apparatus in Galilee, we are essentially talking about middle management for the Roman Empire.
That's a very good way to describe it.
Right. Their primary job is to collect taxes and keep the peace. So when a rogue teacher who just publicly humiliated the Jerusalem elite starts drawing massive crowds and crossing international borders into the Decapolis,
Yeah, that's a problem.
that doesn't look like a polite religious revival. To the Herodian kings and the Roman administrators who are constantly watching for potential unrest, that looks like a severe political liability.
Exactly the dynamic. Rome did not look kindly on unauthorized crowd movements.
No, they definitely didn't.
And it's in the middle of this heavily scrutinized, Gentile-dominated Decapolis region where we get a profoundly vivid healing. They bring him a deaf man with a speech impediment.
And think about how this healing contrasts with the start of the deep dive today. The Jerusalem scribes were terrified of spiritual contamination from unwashed hands.
Right, obsessed with it.
They were obsessed with maintaining sterile boundaries. Yet here is Jesus in Gentile territory, taking this man aside. He puts his fingers into the man's ears, he spits, and he touches the man's tongue.
It is so physical.
It really is. He is weaponizing physical touch in a way that completely shatters the sterile purity laws we talked about at the beginning of the chapter. And according to the text, Mark 7:34, he looks up to heaven and he sighed.
Just a sigh.
Yes, just that he sighed. The text doesn't explain his internal emotional state or give us a psychological breakdown. He simply sighed.
Yeah, we have to stick to what's there.
Exactly. And then he uses a single Aramaic word, ephatha, which translates to be opened.
That specific verse is critical to our understanding of the text's origins. Some scholars believe that preserving the untranslated Aramaic word mid-sentence points directly to an eyewitness source.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Right, protecting the exact sound of that historical moment. It isn't just a polished theological summary of what he did. It's an auditory snapshot of the event, preserved exactly as it sounded in the dirt and noise of the Decapolis.
The grittiness of it is what strikes me. The spit, the physical touch, the preservation of the word ephatha, and the fact that he sighed.
It's very raw.
It grounds the scene in a visceral historical reality. It feels miles away from the institutional headquarters in Jerusalem.
Well, when you look at the thematic arc of this entire chapter, the contrast is profound and deeply unsettling for anyone invested in the status quo.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The chapter begins with a Jerusalem delegation aggressively policing who was clean enough to eat, entirely obsessed with institutional purity, financial loopholes, and boundary markers.
Right.
And it ends in Roman-aligned Gentile territory, with outsiders being physically opened, healed, and completely unable to stay quiet about what they've seen.
Okay, I want to hear from you on this. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on today's historical drama. I'm really curious, looking at the historical and political tension, whose side would you have taken in the tension between the Jerusalem establishment and the Syrophoenician woman?
Yeah, I'd love to read those comments.
Right. Let us know. Also, if you enjoyed today's deep dive into the history and politics of this text, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an exploration. And remember to check the description below for exclusive links to our research, our source documents, and more.
Definitely check those out.
Because here's the final thought I want to leave you with, looking strictly at the facts of how this chapter closes. At the end of this incredible sequence in the Decapolis, Jesus gives a strict order to silence the witnesses of this healing.
Right.
But the order is immediately ignored. The people simply will not stop talking about it, making control of the story completely impossible. With the crowds flatly ignoring the order to stay quiet, what happens next as control of the story becomes completely impossible for both the religious elites and Roman administrators?
It's a huge problem for them.
It really is. You'll have to join us next time to find out.